Anybody who has even a meager interest in history or the past has at one point thought about how the world would be changed today if an event had gone differently. Alternate history is a pretty simple formula. It's history that is altered. Change blank event back in blank time, and you, good sir, have a potentially fun story, scenario, and/or video. The topic range is limitless. No, really, it is. The issue is how many people are going to care. Some history topics will always be more popular than others. Everybody knows what a World War II or Civil War is, even Becky. That's why History Channel had so many shows about Hodor in the early 2000s. Everybody knows who Hodor was, so it got big ratings. But sometimes I don't want to just talk about Hodor. I want to theorize about less known parts of history. Throughout 2017, I had so many ideas I wanted to do, but either they were too specific for general audiences, or the scenario was just pretty shallow. Much like that week-old pizza in your fridge, I don't want these scenarios to go to waste either. This video is frankly a collection of the topics I had no idea what to do with. Because we both know you wouldn't have clicked on this otherwise, Becky. So I'm sharing them all on this one. Each scenario will be different from the last, so think of them like small little videos. So here we go, I don't really know how to segue this. Man has always dared to sail the seas, find new land for our own devices. In the modern 20th century, however, new land is hard to come by. Now, with the miracle of modern engineering, we can bring more land to us. For 10 years, this has been the dream of the Atlantropa project, a modern mythical marvel for Europe's future. By placing a few dams, man can drain the sea and bring out hundreds of square miles of coastline along with it. The Atlantropa project, reclaiming our future. There once was a dream by a single man, an architect named Hermann Sorgel. In the 1920s, he imagined a gargantuan project. If successful, it transformed the very face of Europe. What he thought up was an audacious but ludicrous plan that he believed could bring peace and stability to a continent which had recently lost millions in war. How this would be achieved was by building the largest dams ever devised at both ends of the sea, controlling the water flowing into the Mediterranean. From there, the process would begin. Over a period of 150 years, the sea slowly would evaporate and coastline replace it. A new continent would be born, Atlantropa, a new land consisting of thousands of square miles once underwater. All this coastline was then to be settled and farmed by Europeans. The dams that kept the ocean at bay would be hydroelectric, generating enough power to sustain the entire continent with free, renewable energy. Of course, none of that actually happened. It was just too large of a project, with too many unknowns. However, it's just such a fascinating and odd idea, so let's imagine a timeline where Atlantropa is actually created. Atlantropa was an idea crafted for a utopian world. A world that existed only in Sorgel's mind and didn't reflect reality. Sorgel thought in terms of grand architecture, big projects. Realistically, Atlantropa could never exist. Utopias are not the real world. They're impossible fantasies, and so it'd be an impossible project. If Atlantropa was to exist, we need to imagine an alternate, yet impossible, utopian world. Everyone comes together for Sorgel's vision, ignoring the politics and flaws of that time in history. All the issues, engineering and scientific, that faced Atlantropa are magically solved. All that matters is the reality after his project is created. What world exists afterwards? It is an alternate 1930s. The Depression is in full swing. Unemployment has skyrocketed. For some inexplicable reason, public interest in Sorgel's idea is unnaturally through the roof. The idea of Atlantropa captures the Western imagination. Free energy, millions employed, and new land to settle. In a dark time, it's the light at the end of the tunnel. It's oddly peaceful. After 10 years of building, there isn't another global war. If there was, the cooperation of Europe would end and Atlantropa would never be built. For the plan to work, Germany's ambitions had to be elsewhere, and the war couldn't happen. I'm not saying that's possible, I'm just saying utopia. Utopia is a strange concept. What is the definition of a perfect world is subjective. It can change. Atlantropa was Hermann Sorgel's utopia. It was a society of culture, technology, and politics. Its existence required peace in Europe, free energy for all. However, it also required a world with continuous imperialism. Entire populations would need to be destroyed. In Central Africa, 3 new seas are created using the Mediterranean waters. The climate in Africa was meant to be changed, allowing for future colonization. For Atlantropa to survive, the mindset it was made in, 19th century imperialism, needs to survive as well. This is Hermann Sorgel's utopia. His perfect world wouldn't last. Sometime in the late 20th century, the dams are finished. The water begins to shrink away as the sea evaporates. There is a major problem. The new land isn't as valuable as hoped. It's not fertile, it's entirely useless. Instead of land to settle and fertilize, the sea has left one large salt flat. Simply explained, it's all barren. Sorgel's Atlantropa isn't the savior of Europe like he hoped. Instead, he doomed it. The climate is only becoming hotter without the water to regulate it. Any colonization into North Africa never really happens. All it has done is brought the Sahara closer to Europe as tribespeople hug the shrinking coast. Eventually, the sea disappears entirely. What replaces it isn't a fertile continent, but a salt-covered desert. It's entirely inhospitable. Over the 21st century, places like Italy, the Balkans, Greece, and Spain begin to break down. The dry climate changes the land beyond recognition. Centuries following the Atlantropa project, most of the region is abandoned. Millions fled in a mass exodus up north or to the Americas. It'd be a humanitarian disaster. If the situation was desperate enough, many would even cross into Africa. If the lake project was actually successful, then as southern Europe becomes less hospitable, more Europeans call Central Africa home. Back in the 20s, Venice was prized as a cultural hallmark. It needed the sea to exist. So, to preserve it, Sorgel constructed a giant dam 30 miles away to keep the sea always with Venice. It would be the only water left in the basin. It'd be an interesting idea with this city in the middle of a desert wasteland. Is this the end of the world? No. It is, however, the end of Europe. At least how we know it. If Europe survived, it would be cramped, dry, and facing massive continuous conflict. The groups that once worked together now are competing over what's left. I never made this video because there are so many assumptions that have to be made. It relies on so much being changed and isn't really like a normal scenario. It's almost like fiction. It's not entirely 100% based on reality because Atlantropa isn't based on reality. So I never made it because of that. I do think it makes a very good story of a society that, just like Icarus, flew too close to the sun. Mormons. They exist. And today the general consensus on Mormons is they exist. And that's okay. However, back in the 1850s, the consensus was far different. Mormons were despised for their views, and the feeling was mutual. The best solution was to move out west, away from the public who wasn't too happy about the whole polygamy thing. That journey was led by the nicknamed American Moses Brigham Young to what is today Utah. It was there he imagined Deseret, a massive state that he imagined would encompass much of the West. This never happened, of course. The US didn't want the Mormons holding so much valuable land, But the idea of this Mormon superstate has remained a popular concept in alternate history circles. It's often imagined as this Mormon theocracy in the desert, a state where Mormons force their religion onto a vast border and operate entirely independent of the United States. So what if the state of Deseret actually did exist in an alternate timeline? Say it's an alternate 1850. The proposal for the state of Deseret passes in Congress. How? Don't ask me. All that matters is Deseret exists. It's so large, San Diego and Denver are in the same state. Since I read a lot of alternate history fiction, I'm often influenced by these concepts. When I first imagined the scenario, I thought of a vast religious state ruled by the Latter-day Saints. It'd be a theocracy, with laws made to enforce Mormon doctrine and its very nature clashing with the United States. After reading the proposal for the US state of Deseret, that's right, Deseret wanted to be a US state, not independent, the alternate scenario is far, far different. Right in the text, the Deseret Constitution declares that there must be a separation of church and state, and people should worship in any way they want. Huh. Well, that doesn't really sound like a Mormon theocracy. In fact, in reality, Deseret couldn't be that vast, interesting theocratic state at all if it wanted to be an actual state. In this alternate timeline, it'd simply be a big state in the Union, slightly influenced by Mormonism. We already have something like that. It's called Utah. If this alternate scenario occurred, all Deseret would be is just one very big Utah. That doesn't mean nothing changes. Of course, if a state owns everything from San Diego to Denver, they're going to be influential. Deseret would be one of the wealthiest states in the Union, with access to Nevada, Utah, and Colorado minerals, a lot of land, and most trails and railroads that have to go west. There wouldn't be a Las Vegas, since Utah outlaws gambling. Any other weird law Utah has, you can kind of just imagine as Deseret as well. I think you can see why this wasn't a full video. To me, this alternate reality is just simply too mundane. It'd be a big state, but since it'd have to abide by constitutional laws, that would be it. It'd be pretty boring. Deseret would have some Mormon flair, but much like their haircuts, it'd be kinda bland. A few years ago, I said casually I might do a scenario about the Empire of Ethiopia, say if it industrialized in the 19th century, much like Japan. You people never let me forget about it. I have regretted it ever since. So what does industrialized even mean? It means that Ethiopia by the 1800s would modernize their society. They'd have things like trains and canals, electricity, and create a modern military with weapons to rival Europe. What even was the Empire of Ethiopia? Ethiopia for thousands of years lived on the Horn of Africa as a lone kingdom. It adopted Christianity far before Rome and was unique for its interaction with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. It was one of only 2 African nations that stayed independent from European imperialism, and it was the only kingdom to fend off an invasion from a European country. If anyone in Africa had a shot to be an industrial power, it would be Ethiopia. The reason I haven't talked about this idea for years is I have no idea how to approach this scenario. An industrial Ethiopia is like a lion in a cage. No matter how strong the beast is, the force that surrounds it will always keep it contained. If Ethiopia had a big army, the empire surrounding them could muster a bigger one. If Ethiopia had an air force, the British or Italians could muster a bigger one. Japan is the best example for this scenario. Japan went from an isolated state to a modern naval power in a century. It's really impressive. However, in a conflict with the United States, it immediately lost that navy and resorted to suicidal guerrilla tactics to no avail. In the end, a head start, a larger economy, and better technology always wins the day. So growing the empire through force wouldn't be an option. An industrial Ethiopia would have to be a defensive nation. The only conflict it would ever fight is one of defense, and if that ever happened, Ethiopia would still lose. Now, the reason I never wanted to do this scenario is that's just depressing. Nobody wants to hear Ethiopia lose. So, what about Ethiopian society once it industrializes? An industrial revolution in a country changes the country from the ground up. We can see society shift when machines are introduced because it changes everything from jobs, transportation, education, and standards of living. To see how Ethiopia as a society would change if it industrialized leads to so many questions and possibilities. How can you even predict a societal shift like that? Would it lead to conflict or peace? What new jobs would Ethiopians have? Would industrialized Ethiopia change like Japan, or would it have unintended consequences? Overall, this topic is just confusing. Ethiopia itself is a diverse and complicated nation. If it's somehow industrialized, it'd be surrounded by neighbors who did as well. And society changes so drastically, it leads to more questions than answers. But hey, at least I talked about it. In an alternate timeline, where I was actually an efficient person who had videos out on time, my name wouldn't be Cody. I'd be an entirely different man. Maybe my name would be Kevin. Yes. In a world where I didn't have late videos, my name would be Kevin. But since we're in this timeline, I guess this is Cody of Alternate History Hub.